Welcome back to Hacker News Daily, where we break down the top stories that got the tech community talking. I'm your host, and today we're diving into yesterday's most heated discussions from Hacker News. We reviewed 30 stories that hit the front page, and wow, the 5 that rose to the top really showcase the tensions defining tech right now. We've got regulatory battles reshaping energy policy, developers literally reinventing the web browser, government surveillance creeping into cryptocurrency, breakthrough AI models that might change everything, and a fundamental challenge to how Silicon Valley hires engineers. These aren't just tech stories, they're stories about power, innovation, and what we value as an industry. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's dive into what had everyone arguing yesterday on Hacker News. Now, the Hacker News discussion on this, wow, it really shows how complicated this whole thing is. You've got people pointing out that nuclear is insanely expensive. We're talking $10 to $20 million per megawatt, with construction times measured in decades, not years. One commenter broke down how dispatched solar and wind is supposedly 1/5 the cost of new nuclear. That's a massive difference, if true. But then others are arguing it's not just about cost, it's about energy independence. Europe's still trying to wean itself off Russian gas, and nuclear could be a key part of that strategy. Though, and this is where things get a bit awkward, one user pointed out that the same ruling that classified nuclear as clean also gave natural gas that designation. So it's not quite the pure environmental victory some are making it out to be. There's even this conspiracy theory floating around in the comments that We Planet, one of the pro-nuclear organizations, might actually be funded by fossil fuel interests. The idea being they're using nuclear advocacy as a way to delay the real renewable energy transition because they know nuclear takes so long to build. It's certainly a take. What strikes me most about this whole debate is how it reveals the tension between what we might want in theory versus what we can actually build in practice. Sure, nuclear might be clean once it's running, but if it takes 15 years and billions of euros to build a single plant while solar panels are getting cheaper every month, at what point does perfect become the enemy of good enough? The courts ruled, the policy's shifting, but reading through these comments, it's clear the actual debate is far from over. You've got economic realists battling it out with energy independence advocates, while environmentalists are split right down the middle on whether this helps or hurts the climate cause. It's messy, it's complicated, and honestly, that's probably exactly the kind of discussion we should be having about something this important. Transition to story 3. Speaking of governments making controversial decisions that split communities down the middle, let's talk about what's happening with cryptocurrency regulation in the United States. All right, now we're diving into something that really got the Hacker News crowd fired up. The Treasury is expanding the Patriot Act to attack Bitcoin's self-custody. This one pulled in over 600 points and nearly 500 comments. And honestly, the discussion is way more interesting than the article itself, which apparently had so little actual content that our summarizer basically threw up its hands and said, "There's nothing here." But here's where it gets fascinating. The community completely tore this headline apart. The consensus: this is basically clickbait, dressed up as serious financial news. See, what's actually happening, according to the commenters who dug into the Treasury notice from 2023, isn't an attack on self-custody at all. It's the Treasury flagging certain suspicious transaction patterns. Things like mixing services, structuring transactions to avoid reporting thresholds, that sort of thing. The same stuff that would raise red flags with traditional banking. One commenter, Ian Mears, made this brilliant point that I think cuts right to the heart of Bitcoin's privacy problem. They said Treasury isn't actually coming after Bitcoin because, well, Bitcoin doesn't need their help to be surveillance-friendly. They called it Twitter for your bank account, which is harsh but kind of accurate. Every transaction is public, permanent, traceable. The Bitcoin community has had years to implement better privacy features and just hasn't. And this opens up this whole can of worms about financial privacy in the digital age. Several commenters pointed out that we're seeing this gradual expansion of surveillance powers that started with the Patriot Act. Remember, that was supposed to be about terrorism, and now it's touching everything from crypto to your regular bank account. One person mentioned how banks are now required to report cash transactions over $10,000. And if you deliberately keep transactions under that threshold to avoid reporting, that's illegal too. It's called structuring, and it's a federal crime even if the money is completely legitimate. What really struck me in this discussion is how it reveals this fundamental tension in the crypto world. On one hand, you've got people who see Bitcoin as this tool for financial freedom, right? Get your money out of the traditional banking system, be your own bank, all that. But on the other hand, Bitcoin's transparent ledger means that anyone using privacy tools, even for completely legitimate reasons, immediately looks suspicious. It's like, imagine if every time you closed your curtains, your neighbors assumed you were doing something illegal. The broader debate here is really about where we draw the line between legitimate government oversight and financial surveillance overreach. Some commenters argued that anti-money laundering rules are necessary and reasonable. Others pointed out that financial privacy used to be the default. You could walk into a bank with cash, no questions asked, as long as you weren't obviously up to something shady. Now, however, every transaction is potentially scrutinized, analyzed, flagged. There's also this interesting technical angle that came up. Some users discussed how Bitcoin's lack of privacy features has created this weird situation where the privacy tools that do exist, mixers, tumblers, coin-join implementations, are automatically viewed with suspicion by regulators. It's almost like Bitcoin accidentally created the worst of both worlds, a permanent public record of all transactions and tools that make you look guilty for wanting privacy. What I find most telling is that despite the inflammatory headline, the actual Treasury guidelines seem pretty mundane. They're basically saying, hey, if someone's obviously trying to hide the source of their funds through multiple mixing services, maybe take a closer look. But the fact that this relatively boring regulatory notice sparked such intense debate shows just how sensitive people are about financial privacy right now. And honestly, they should be. Once you normalize total financial surveillance, it's really hard to put that genie back in the bottle. Now, while governments are grappling with how to regulate existing technology, the AI world isn't slowing down one bit. In fact, they're accelerating in ways that might make all these regulatory discussions moot. All right, moving on to something that's got the AI community absolutely buzzing. We're talking about Q-When-3 Next, which just dropped and is causing quite the stir on Hacker News with over 500 points and a really fascinating debate in the comments. So here's what's wild about this. Alibaba's team has basically pulled off what feels like a magic trick with model efficiency. They're claiming, and stick with me here because these numbers are genuinely remarkable, they've got a model with 80 billion parameters total, but only 3 billion active at any given time that performs like models with 235 billion parameters. That's not a typo. We're talking about roughly a 10x efficiency gain here, which, if true, could completely change the economics of running these large language models. The secret sauce appears to be this combination of architectural innovations they're calling MOE. That's mixture of experts, along with something called gated delta networks. Now, the technical discussion in the comments gets pretty deep into the weeds, but essentially what they've done is figured out how to be incredibly selective about which parts of the model activate for different tasks. It's like having a massive team of specialists, but instead of consulting everyone for every question, you only wake up the exact experts you need for that specific problem. One commenter who seems to really understand the architecture pointed out that they've implemented multi-token prediction without needing additional embedding matrices, that's actually a pretty elegant solution to a complex problem. It means the model can look ahead and predict multiple tokens at once, without the usual computational overhead. But here's where it gets interesting. Not everyone's buying it. There's this one user who's basically calling BS on the whole thing, saying it might just be benchmaxing, when models are specifically optimized to ace the standardized tests, but maybe aren't as impressive in real-world use. Their argument is pretty compelling, actually. They're saying there's no way you can compress that much world knowledge into such a small active parameter set without losing something significant. The context length is another hot topic. QN3 Next supports 256,000 tokens, which is double what the previous version could handle, and it can generate summaries up to 32,000 tokens long. Now, Alibaba's calling this ultra-long context, but there's this developer in the comments who's like, hold up, that's not ultra-long for what I do. They're apparently regularly working with code bases that blow past 100,000 tokens, and they're saying they need models that can handle 1 million tokens or more for their work. It's a fair point. What counts as long really depends on your use case. What I find fascinating about this whole discussion is that we're at this inflection point where the conversation isn't just about making models bigger anymore. It's about making them smarter, more efficient. The infrastructure demands for running these massive models have been a huge bottleneck, right? If QN3 Next efficiency claims hold up under scrutiny, we could see a democratization of AI capabilities that weren't accessible to smaller companies or independent developers before. The skeptics in the thread raise valid concerns, though. One person pointed out that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and until we see independent verification and real-world testing beyond the benchmarks, we should probably temper our excitement a bit. But even the skeptics seem to acknowledge that if even half of what's being claimed is true, this represents a significant step forward in model architecture. You know what really strikes me about this? We're seeing this pattern where Chinese AI labs like Alibaba are not just catching up, but actually pioneering new approaches. The competition is driving innovation at a pace that's honestly hard to keep up with sometimes. Just when you think you understand the state of the art, boom, someone drops something like this that potentially changes the whole game. Speaking of solving problems in unexpected ways, that brings us to a story that really challenges how we think about technical problem solving, especially in the context of job interviews. All right, now we're diving into something that really stirred up the hornet's nest on Hacker News. Many hard LeetCode problems are easy constraint problems. This one got 445 points and nearly 400 comments. And honestly, I can see why people have strong feelings about this. So here's the deal. The author basically had this revelation that completely flips the script on technical interviews. They failed a job interview because they couldn't solve the classic coin change problem using dynamic programming. You know the one. Given some coin denominations, find the minimum number of coins to make change for a specific amount. It's like a rite of passage in tech interviews, right? But here's where it gets interesting. They later discovered you can solve this supposedly hard problem with just a few lines of code using something called a constraint solver. Let me paint you a picture of what they're talking about. Traditionally, you'd need to write this complex, dynamic programming solution, keeping track of subproblems, building up a table of optimal solutions. It's the kind of thing you either know the pattern for or you're basically toast in a 45-minute interview. But with a constraint solver like MiniZinc or a Z3, you literally just describe what you want. Hey, I need coins that add up to 37 cents, and I want the minimum number of them. And boom, the solver figures it out for you. The author shows this beautiful example where the greedy algorithm, always picking the biggest coin first, completely fails. With coins of 10, 9, and 1 cent, if you need 37 cents, the greedy approach gives you 3 tens and 7 ones. That's 10 coins total. But the optimal solution? Just use 4 9-cent coins and 1 penny. 5 coins. The constraint solver nails this immediately, while most of us would be sweating bullets trying to work out the dynamic programming approach under interview pressure. Now, the Hacker News crowd had some thoughts about this, and they weren't holding back. The overwhelming sentiment was basically, yeah, that's cool and all, but you're missing the point. See, the thing is, companies aren't really testing whether you know about constraint solvers. They're testing whether you can think algorithmically, whether you can break down problems, optimize solutions, all that computer science fundamental stuff.
But here's where the discussion got really spicy. A lot of experienced developers jumped in saying the whole LeetCode interview process is fundamentally broken anyway. One commenter put it perfectly. They said these interviews filter out seasoned engineers who could actually improve your codebase while selecting for people who've memorized a bunch of trick solutions. It's like, imagine hiring a chef based on whether they can solve chemistry equations about molecular gastronomy instead of whether they can actually cook a decent meal. There was this fascinating split in the comments between people at different types of companies. Folks from more mature organizations were saying, we don't do this leak code nonsense anymore. We test for practical skills, system design, how you'd actually work with a team. Meanwhile, others were defending it, saying that algorithmic thinking and that kind of cleverness is actually a valuable signal, even if the specific problems are artificial. One commenter, Ripped Britches was their handle, had this contrarian take that I actually love. They said if someone showed them both solutions in an interview, here's the dynamic programming approach, and by the way, here's how you'd solve it with a constraint solver in the real world, they'd hire them on the spot. Because that shows real engineering thinking, knowing multiple approaches and when to use each one. The deeper issue here, and what makes this story resonate with so many people, is that it highlights this disconnect between interview theater and actual engineering work. In the real world, if you needed to solve an optimization problem, would you spend hours implementing dynamic programming from scratch? Or would you reach for a well-tested tool that's specifically designed for this? It's like, we're testing people on whether they can build a hammer from scratch when the job is actually about knowing which hammer to use and how to swing it effectively. What really struck me about this whole discussion is how it reveals the anxiety and frustration in our industry around hiring practices. You've got brilliant engineers who can build amazing systems but freeze up on leak code problems, and you've got fresh grads who've grinded hundreds of problems but might struggle with real-world complexity. The constraint solver angle is almost beside the point. It's really about what we value and how we measure it.
And you know what? The author makes a solid case that constraint solvers are ridiculously underutilized in general. These tools can solve scheduling problems, resource allocation, all sorts of optimization challenges that come up in real software development. But most developers don't even know they exist because we're too busy memorizing how to reverse a linked list in place or find the longest palindromic substring. And speaking of developers doing things in unconventional ways that make people question everything, now let me ask you something. When was the last time you had 30 browser tabs open and couldn't find the one you actually needed? Our next story is about PostHog completely throwing out the web design rulebook. They've redesigned their website to look and function like an operating system, and the internet has some very strong opinions about it. So here's what happened. The folks at PostHog got fed up with what they call the tab explosion problem. You know how it goes. You're researching something, maybe comparing different products or diving deep into documentation, and suddenly you've got dozens of tabs all showing the same favicon. It's like trying to find a specific paper in a stack where they all look identical. PostHog's solution? They said, forget traditional web design. Let's just build Windows 95 inside your browser. And I mean that literally. Their new site has draggable windows, window snapping, keyboard shortcuts, even a bookmark app. You can have multiple articles open side by side, watch a video while reading documentation. Heck, they even threw in some games you can play while browsing. It's absolutely wild. The philosophical argument they're making is actually pretty interesting. They're asking why we accept certain web conventions as gospel. Like, why do we make people scroll through these endless landing pages with massive hero sections and oversized footers? What's the point of all that white space? Their take is basically, what if we just made better ways to consume content instead of following patterns that don't actually serve users? Now, the Hacker News crowd, they're having a field day with this one. The discussion thread exploded to over 450 comments, and wow, people are divided. On one side, you've got users like HLYAN who absolutely love it. They're saying things like, I found their products, pricing, and documentation in seconds instead of scrolling through marketing fluff for 10 minutes. Another developer called it the best fake OS implementation they've seen in years of web development. But then, oh boy, the critics are not holding back. Multiple users are reporting catastrophic performance issues. We're talking 5 frames per second when scrolling, 29% CPU usage just for dragging a window around. Someone with an M4 Pro, that's Apple's latest and greatest chip, said the site was practically unusable. That's not great. The technical criticisms go deeper, though. People are pointing out that PostHub broke pretty much every web convention that makes the internet usable. The back button doesn't work properly. You can't use Command F to search the page because it only searches within individual windows. Right-click menus are broken. Deep linking is gone. One commenter put it perfectly. They've replaced the user-controlled window management system that I've spent years customizing with their own developer-controlled system that I can't change. What's fascinating is this isn't even a new idea. Developers have been trying to turn websites into operating systems since the late 90s. Remember when Flash sites would have their own custom scroll bars and navigation? There's a reason that trend died. Users already have an operating system they know how to use. They don't want to learn a new one for every website they visit. The performance issues are particularly damning because PostHog is a developer tools company. Their customers are technical users with powerful machines. If a site is bringing an M4 Pro to its knees, what's it doing to someone on a 5-year-old laptop? One user measured it. The site loads 15 megabytes of JavaScript. That's more than some entire applications. But here's what I find most interesting about this whole thing. PostHog knows this is controversial. They explicitly say the design will make your brain revolt at first. They're intentionally creating what they call a jarring experience. It's a bold move, especially for a company that needs to attract enterprise customers who typically prefer boring but functional over innovative but broken. The debate really crystallizes around a fundamental question. Is this genuine innovation or just complexity for complexity's sake? Are they solving real problems or creating new ones? Because, yes, tab management is a legitimate issue, but your browser already has features for that. You can use tab groups, multiple windows, bookmarks. The question is whether re-implementing an entire operating system in JavaScript is really the solution, or if it's just, well, showing off. I've got to say, I admire the ambition. In a world of cookie-cutter SaaS sites that all look like they came from the same template, PostHog is definitely standing out. Whether that's a good thing or a cautionary tale about over-engineering, I guess that depends on whether you're one of the people whose CPU is currently melting trying to drag a window around their site. And that's what made yesterday such a fascinating day on Hacker News. From the EU courts reshaping energy policy to developers literally rebuilding the web browser, from government surveillance expanding into crypto to AI models that might be too good to be true, and finally to the eternal debate about whether we're hiring engineers the right way, these stories capture the tech world at a crossroads. What really strikes me about yesterday's top discussions is how they all touch on this fundamental tension between innovation and practicality, between what's technically possible and what actually makes sense. Whether it's building nuclear reactors that take decades, websites that need supercomputers to scroll, or interview processes that test the wrong skills, or constantly wrestling with the gap between clever solutions and real-world constraints. These were the 5 stories that rose to the top from the 30 that appeared on Hacker News yesterday, the ones that got people arguing, thinking, and occasionally rage typing in the comments. Tomorrow, who knows what will capture the community's attention, but that's what makes this corner of the internet so endlessly fascinating. Thanks for joining me for today's deep dive into yesterday's top Hacker News stories. I'm your host, and this has been Hacker News Daily. Until next time, keep questioning, keep building, and maybe, just maybe, keep your website looking like a website.